private was 19 years old, and he was sitting on the running board of a supply truck on a frozen Belgian road, trying to remember the last time he had eaten something warm. His name was Paul Garrett. He was from Lexington, Kentucky, and 3 weeks earlier he had been moving through the Ardennes with his company, digging foxholes into ground that was frozen so hard the entrenching tools rang like bells when they hit it. Now he was sitting on a running board with his hands wrapped around nothing, no cup, no canteen, just his own fingers pressed together for whatever warmth they could generate between them, which was not much. The convoy had stopped moving 20 minutes ago for reasons nobody had explained to him, and probably nobody had explained to anyone else either. He was not thinking about the war at that particular moment. He was thinking about whether the field kitchen was going to come forward that evening, and whether it had come forward the previous evening, and whether the evening before that counted as the last time he had eaten something that required heat to prepare. He was working through the math of it when he heard footsteps on the iced road and looked up and saw 3 stars on a helmet and came off that running board so fast he nearly fell. George Patton told him to stand at ease. Then he asked him a question so simple it should not have required asking in the middle of a combat operation in December in Belgium. He asked when the private had last eaten a hot meal. Garrett thought about it the way a man thinks about something that happened a long time ago, rather than something that happened a few days prior. 3 days, he said, maybe 4. Cold K rations, tinned meat that had the temperature of the ground it had been sitting on, crackers that tasted like cardboard, chocolate that tasted like chalk. By the 3rd day, they had been rationing even those. Patton stood on that frozen road and listened to all of it, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The way a pressure gauge changes when the reading crosses a threshold that cannot be ignored. He turned to his aide and asked one question. Who commands this sector? What followed over the next several hours was not a battle. No one fired a weapon, no territory changed hands. But for the men of Garrett's company, sitting in foxholes dug into frozen Belgian earth, eating cold tinned rations, while a report about their situation gathered dust in a stack of paperwork at a warm battalion headquarters a mile behind them, it was the day the army they were fighting for demonstrated that someone at the top was actually paying attention. And it started with a general getting out of his jeep on a frozen road and asking a 19-year-old private a question that no one at battalion headquarters had thought to ask in 4 days. To understand what Patton found and why it mattered, you have to understand what the Ardennes looked like in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had begun on December 16th with 3 German armies tearing through American lines with a speed and violence that caught the Allied command in a state of shock that bordered on panic. The weather that accompanied the German offensive was as brutal as the assault itself. Temperatures at night dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit and below. The roads were sheets of ice that sent trucks sideways and jeeps into ditches. The tree lines were gray and still and full of Germans who knew this terrain far better than the American boys who had been dropped into it. Air support was grounded because the cloud cover sat so low and so thick that aircraft could not operate, which meant that the artillery advantage the Americans had relied on through the previous months of the campaign was effectively neutralized. The American infantrymen who bore the weight of stopping this offensive were in foxholes dug into frozen ground, wrapped in whatever they had managed to carry, unable to light fires because the smoke would bring in German artillery within minutes. They sat in the dark and the cold, and they waited and they ate whatever they had. And when what they had ran out, they waited for the field kitchen to come forward. The field kitchen was supposed to come forward twice a day. It was supposed to reach the forward positions regardless of weather, regardless of road conditions, regardless of the fact that the roads were dangerous and the drivers were afraid, and the logistics chain that connected a warm headquarters to a frozen foxhole was longer and more fragile than anyone had planned for adequately. Hot food twice a day in combat conditions in December in Belgium was not a luxury. It was the difference between men who could fight and men who were too cold and too depleted to do anything except try to survive until morning. The field kitchen serving Garrett's sector had stopped coming forward 3 days before Patton found him on that road. No message had been sent forward to explain the absence. No alternate arrangement had been made. The men simply waited for trucks that did not come and ate what they had. And when what they had was gone, they ate less. And when there was less of that, they waited and got colder and weaker. and said nothing because in the hierarchy of the American Army in December 1944, a private in a foxhole did not have a reliable mechanism for telling someone at battalion headquarters that he had not eaten in 3 days. The man responsible for feeding Garrett's sector was Staff Sergeant Donald Briggs, 31 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Briggs was not negligent. He was not indifferent. He had known his men were not getting fed, and he had been working the problem for 2 days with the persistence of someone who understood exactly what cold and hungry meant to a man in a fighting position. The problem was a road junction 1 mile behind the front, a junction that German artillery had been targeting since the offensive began. 2 trucks had been hit at that junction in the first 48 hours of the Battle of the Bulge. After the second truck burned, the convoy commanders who used that route made a collective decision to stop using it, which was entirely rational from the perspective of the convoy commanders and entirely catastrophic from the perspective of every soldier whose food supply moved through that junction. Briggs had identified an alternate route the day before Patton arrived. The alternate route was longer and more difficult, but it was passable, and it was not being targeted by German artillery. He had trucks ready to move the moment someone authorized the operation. The problem was that the alternate route crossed into another battalion sector, and crossing into another battalion sector without authorization was not something a staff sergeant could do unilaterally. So Briggs did what the system required him to do. He submitted a request for authorization through his supply officer, a 25-year-old lieutenant from Cleveland named Frank Sykes. Sykes received the request and included it in a report to battalion headquarters. The report was accurate, complete, and entirely buried. It arrived at headquarters as one item in a stack of 40 reports covering every administrative and logistical matter that had crossed the supply officer's desk in the previous 2 days. Nobody at battalion headquarters had flagged it as urgent. Nobody had looked at the stack with the specific intention of identifying which items represented men going without food in combat weather and which items represented requisitions for spare parts and office supplies. The report sat third from the bottom of the stack for 41 hours. During those 41 hours, Garrett's company ate cold tinned meat and crackers and waited. During those same 41 hours, the staff at battalion headquarters ate regular meals in a warm building with electric lights and spent their evenings doing the things that people do when they are not in foxholes in December in Belgium. When Patton's aide reached Lieutenant Colonel George Carver, the battalion commander, the message was blunt. Why had the men in Garrett's sector gone without a hot meal for 3 days? Carver called his supply officer. The supply officer said the matter was pending. Carver asked how long it had been pending. 41 hours, the supply officer said. Carver closed his eyes for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then he asked for Sergeant Briggs. Briggs arrived 14 minutes later and laid out the entire situation in 90 seconds, with the economy of a man who had been living with this problem and had all the relevant information organized and ready because he had been hoping someone would finally ask. The blocked junction, the alternate route, the truck sitting ready, the request submitted 43 hours ago, the authorization that had never come. Carver listened to all of it and then asked Briggs one question. Why had he not simply implemented the alternate route without waiting for authorization? Briggs explained that the route crossed into another battalion sector. Carver nodded slowly. Then he told Briggs to get the trucks moving and said he would clear the authorization himself. Briggs left at a jog. Carver turned to his supply officer and said, in a voice that had gone completely flat, that the man had buried a report about soldiers going without food in the middle of a combat operation in December in Belgium. The supply officer began to explain. Carver told him that the explanation was not necessary and that he should find the report. The report was third from the bottom of the stack. Patton arrived at battalion headquarters an hour later. He walked in wearing his combat gear with 3 stars on his helmet, and the ivory-handled revolvers on his belt, and the expression of a man who had already formed his conclusions and was arriving to confirm them. Carver met him at the door and came to attention and saluted. Patton returned the salute and told him to tell him what had happened. Carver told him everything: the blocked road junction, the alternate route that Briggs had found, the request that had sat in a stack for 41 hours because nobody had identified it as urgent. Patton listened without interrupting, which was not always his way, and when Carver finished, he was quiet for a moment that the people in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. Then he asked if the men were eating now. Carver said the first truck should reach the forward positions within the hour. Patton nodded. Then he walked to the supply officer's desk and picked up a handful of reports from the stack and read the dates and the subjects. Not quickly, deliberately, the way a man reads something when he wants the people watching him to understand exactly what he is reading and why it matters. He set them back down. He asked how many people worked in the headquarters. 14, Carver told him, plus the commander. Patton looked at the room and then looked at Carver and said that 14 people in a warm building with regular meals and lights at night had allowed a report about men going without food in a foxhole to sit unread for 41 hours. Carver said, "Yes, sir." Patton walked to the window and looked out at the tree line, gray, white, and still, somewhere behind which Garrett's company was still in their fighting positions. He stood there for a moment, and then he turned back and told Carver that the supply officer had failed his men by treating a report about food like a requisition for office supplies, and that this was a leadership failure that belonged to Carver personally, because a report about men going without food in combat weather should have been on the commander's desk within 1 hour of submission, and Carver should have known the answer before Patton had to ask the question. Carver said, "Yes, sir." Patton told him that the supply officer was going to spend the next 2 weeks forward with the infantry. Not as a supply officer, as a rifleman. He was going to eat what the men ate and sleep where they slept and pull guard duty at 3 in the morning in temperatures that made the winter feel like a personal insult. When he came back, he was going to understand with his body and not just with his mind exactly what a hot meal in December meant to a man in a foxhole. Carver said, "Yes, sir." Patton moved toward the door and then stopped and turned back and asked about Sergeant Briggs, the man who had found the alternate route and had lots of trucks already and had been waiting for someone to tell him to go. Carver told him. Patton's jaw tightened in a way that the people in the room recognized as the closest he came to visible emotion in a professional setting. He told Carver that Briggs had the answer and nobody had asked him. He asked for Briggs's name and unit number and said he would handle the promotion directly. Then he walked out into the cold. The first hot meal reached Garrett's position at 4:30 that evening. 2 trucks with insulated containers. Beef stew, bread, coffee hot enough to see the steam rising off it in the December air. Garrett heard the trucks from 200 yards out through the trees. Then the smell reached him, the specific smell of actual cooked food arriving in a place where cooked food had been absent for 3 days. And something in his chest did something that surprised him. He was 19 years old and he had been in combat in Belgium in December for 3 weeks, and he had believed, in the way that very young men in very bad situations begin to believe things, that the cold tinned meat and the hard crackers were simply what his life was now and would continue to be. The smell of that stew coming through the trees at 4:30 in the afternoon hit him with a force that was completely disproportionate to the arrival of food. He cried. He was not embarrassed about it later, when he talked about that evening to his family, because by the time he was old enough to talk about it, he understood that what he had been crying about was not the food. It was the knowledge that someone had asked the right question. Sykes spent 14 days forward with an infantry platoon, and it changed him in a specific and irreversible way that certain experiences change people. He ate K rations in a foxhole. He pulled guard duty at 3 in the morning, in temperatures that turned his breath to ice before it left his face. He watched the field kitchen arrive every morning and stood in line with the enlisted men and waited his turn with his mess tin. And when he got his food, he did not eat it immediately. He stood for a moment and looked at the men around him, unshaved and exhausted and hollow-eyed, holding their tins against their chests for the warmth before they ate the contents. He thought about the report. 3rd from the bottom, 41 hours. He had not flagged it as urgent because he had not understood that urgency was a function of consequence rather than a function of rank. A staff sergeant's request submitted through proper channels did not look urgent on paper. Men going without food in a foxhole in December was urgent in reality, and the gap between those two things was exactly the space where his failure had lived. He ate the stew slowly. He did not rush it. The men around him did not rush it either. Nobody rushed a hot meal in the Ardennes in December 1944. Sergeant Donald Briggs received his promotion to technical sergeant effective December 22, 1944. The paperwork was signed by Patton personally. In the remarks section, where military paperwork typically contained administrative language that no one ever read. Patton had written 4 words, found the answer, acted. Briggs carried those 4 words for the rest of his life without fully understanding them for several weeks after the promotion came through. He told a fellow sergeant that he had not done anything exceptional. He had seen the problem, worked out the solution, and waited for someone to authorize him to implement it. The other sergeant told him that this was precisely the point. The system had failed, and Briggs had not failed with it. He had found the answer and held it ready. And when someone finally asked him, he delivered it in 90 seconds. In an organization where problems disappeared into stacks of paper and authorization chains that moved at the speed of institutional inertia, a man who had the answer ready was worth promoting regardless of what the paperwork said about his current rank. Patton never wrote about that afternoon in his diary. He did not include it in his memoirs. It was not a battle in any recognizable sense. No one fired a weapon. No ground changed hands. The incident did not appear in the historical record that journalists and historians assembled from official documents and after-action reports. From the perspective of the Third Army's operations in December 1944, it was a footnote so small it barely qualified as a footnote. But within Garrett's company, and within the battalion headquarters where a stack of reports had been sorted by something other than consequence, it became the kind of story that men carried forward into the rest of their lives and told at specific moments, usually in December, usually when the temperature dropped and the world outside looked gray and cold, and the distance between a warm room and a frozen foxhole seemed suddenly and uncomfortably real. Sykes returned to battalion headquarters after his 14 days forward and did not ask for his desk back. He asked Carver to reassign him to logistics coordination for the forward units, a role that meant spending more time closer to the men and less time behind a desk sorting reports into stacks. Carver gave him the assignment without comment. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January, Sykes had built a system around the lesson he had learned in a Belgian foxhole. Every report concerning food, water, or medical supply for forward units went to the top of the stack automatically. If it remained unresolved after 12 hours, it escalated without anyone having to make that decision. The system removed the human judgment that had failed Garrett's company and replaced it with a mechanism that treated urgency as a function of what the report was about rather than who had submitted it. He called it the Garrett Rule, though he never told Garrett that, and Garrett never knew. Garrett went home to Lexington, Kentucky in September 1945. He worked at his father's hardware store for 30 years and raised a family, and was not, by his family's account, a man who talked much about the war. He had seen things in the Ardennes that did not organize themselves neatly into dinner, table conversation, and he had made peace with that silence in the way that men of his generation generally did. But every December, when the temperature dropped and the first snow came, and the world outside went gray and cold and still, he made sure there was hot coffee ready by 6 in the morning. His wife noticed the pattern and eventually asked about it. He told her about a Belgian road in December 1944, about a supply convoy stopped in the ice, about a general with 3 stars on his helmet getting out of a jeep and walking up to a private sitting on a running board and asking him a simple question. He told her about the stew that arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, about the smell coming through the trees, about what it felt like to understand that someone had asked the right question and then actually done something about the answer. Something should not be allowed to get lost in a stack, he told her. That is all. That is the whole thing. The lesson that afternoon on a frozen Belgian road contained is not complicated, and it is not specific to armies or wars, or the particular institutional failures of a battalion headquarters in December 1944. The distance between a problem and its solution is almost never as large as the distance between the person who has the solution and the person with the authority to implement it. Briggs had the answer for 43 hours before anyone asked him. The report existed. The alternate route existed. The trucks were ready. Everything required to solve the problem was available and had been available for nearly 2 days. And the only thing standing between Garrett's company and a hot meal was a piece of paper sitting in a stack in a warm building where nobody was hungry. Patton understood something that most leaders understand in theory and very few practice consistently. The question you ask when you get out of the Jeep and walk to the front matters less than the fact that you got out of the Jeep at all. A leader who stays in the warm building will always believe the reports on his desk represent the reality at the front. A leader who gets out of the Jeep discovers the difference between what the reports say and what the private on the running board knows. And that difference is usually where the actual problem lives and where the actual answer is waiting.